Hello and welcome to this talk on climate grief and christening the world. We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the moment and let our illusions die. For one species to mourn another is a new thing under the sun. Confronting the reality of climate and ecological collapse requires us to confront a shared story about human sin, and one we can tell with punishingly accurate detail. It has never been easier to acquire knowledge about the many ways humans have failed, and it has never been easier to map the ways that the most powerful humans glimpsed these failures before they arrived and pursued them anyway. But the challenge in communicating this shared story is that it does not lead to a shared set of human experiences. The demands of our lives have alienated us from other creatures, whether human or non human, at precisely the time when our very survival depends on our ability to speak together about the world we are losing. We cannot even articulate our unease, and so most of the time we do not. In The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh describes this descriptive failure as a kind of collective cultural dishonesty. As extractive and finance capitalism continues to homogenize the cities and industrial centers of the world, so too its accompanying story of uniformity, predictability, and gradual progress has spread, rendering the realities of chaotic and violent futures unthinkable to more and more of us. Look, he says, at the colonial legacy of cities built on low lying and precarious shores: Mumbai, New York, Hong Kong, Kolkata, Fukushima. The truth does not align with our desires, and so we have suppressed it. In essence, we do not want to look ourselves in the face. How can we participate in the kind of attentive truthfulness that will transform us? Those involved with climate activism research or who live on the front lines of anthropogenic loss are increasingly describing experiences of climate and ecological grief, emerging both as an unchosen response and also a chosen practice that can help us live more truthfully and discern what is really of value as the biosphere changes beyond recognition. But does it matter how we grieve or what we grieve? In this paper, I focus on one practice that can assist in performing good, transformative grief: the act of naming. One of the problems we face in our version of Western culture is a tendency to treat our exciting range of responses to the world, what we often call our emotions, as essentially personal, that is, they have little to do with the experiences of others, and in some sense, inevitable. We don't choose or change them. This means they are beyond moral judgment. Here's a summary of climate grief from Climate and Mind, a project established by psychotherapist Andrew Bryant. He writes, "There is no right way to grieve. We should be wary of talking about grief in terms of rigid, universal stages or tasks. Having a fixed idea about how we should feel about particular loss can make it difficult to notice how we actually feel. No model can override your personal experience or deny other equally valid ways of conceiving of and working through loss." As short term advice for individual emotional distress, this therapeutic approach is compassionate and useful. But climate and ecological grief is not a temporary private state from which we can recover. Climate and ecological breakdown are grief multipliers, which is to say that the sources and severity of this grief will grow over time, and climate change will also make other suffering more extreme. We need to ask how to grieve well, and admit that as humans we can grieve badly, both in what we grieve and how we grieve. If our culture's climate and ecological grief is focused on mourning our former lives of guilt free wastefulness, it is misdirected. And if our grief or anxiety is worked out by pushing for nationalistic control of our borders, or by hoarding wealth for an unstable future, or even in nihilistic excess, then it needs urgent redirection. Grief, like our other emotional responses to the world, is a learned behavior. We are constantly learning what is worthy of our grief and what is not, and whose grief matters more to us. The ways emotions are expressed are a mirror of our underpinning experiences of the world, and these are experiences filtered by our access to power. To give an example, in January 2021, the world looked on in horror as bushfires across Australia spiraled out of control. Australians huddled on beaches as the sky turned to smoke and ash. 28 people died, 150 homes were destroyed, and there was devastating loss to wildlife. The images of burnt animal bodies stuck on barbed wire fences rightly triggered fear and disgust. But people from across the globe sent outpourings of love, prayer, and donations, as they should. I lay awake at night, sleepless with dread, as I followed updates on the destruction. I prayed for rain. I have no Australian family and have never visited the country, but I felt compelled to participate in the groaning of Australian earth. In April 2020, 80,000 people were displaced by heavy flooding in the South Kivu province of the Democratic Republic of Congo. 15,000 homes were destroyed, and we do not know exactly how many died. The province is home to nearly 1 million internally displaced people, a result of ongoing civil war, funded by slave labor mining, which repeatedly and persistently destroys the earth and her creatures, both human and non-human. Violence and poverty have driven the illegal bushmeat trade, with over 1 million tons of wild animals killed every year. The story of ecological destruction in that country is the story of technological wealth in the West. I have Congolese siblings who arrived in the UK as teenage refugees and were cared for by my parents. The story of that country is part of the story of my family. And when I heard about the flooding there, I felt a pang of sadness, sent some money, and then forgot about it. Whose grief merits our attention? Which bodies prompt lament? I'm not trying to directly compare the severity of events in Australia and the Congo, nor am I saying that it is inherently wrong to feel more grief for one than the other. We are finite creatures who cannot and should not be expected to respond to every death in a dying world in the same way. Our social networks influence us to feel grief about something we hear more about, or events that feel more unusual. If grief is an expression of love, our grief takes on the shape of the places and creatures to whom we intimately belong. Our losses are particular: creatures, seasons and rhythms, futures, forests that we know or feel connected to. And this is not intrinsically wrong. But our feelings of grief are not just bound by space. They are racialized, politicized. We are taught through exposure, through culture, to feel greater empathy for those with proximity to power, even while knowing that they have, in real, measurable terms, suffered less. Those places on the earth where wounds are deeper, inextricably woven into history, are also those whose wounds are not grieved in public. And this grief is, for better or worse, powerful in shaping our action in the world. We can see this play out in other arenas beyond anthropogenic loss, which is the term that I use to describe the losses that are a result of the way of human activity in the world. In the wake of the United States militant response to 9/11, Judith Butler's Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence asks, what makes for a grievable life? Rather than grief being an unbidden, spontaneous, or morally neutral act, Butler presents grief as revealing the relational and moral priorities individuals and communities already possess. She writes, when we lose certain people, or when we are dispossessed from a place or a community, we may simply feel that we are undergoing something temporary, that mourning will be over and some restoration of prior order will be achieved. But maybe when we undergo what we do, something about who we are is revealed, something that delineates the ties we have to others, that shows us that these ties constitute what we are, ties or bonds that compose us. Butler emphasizes the collective dimension of response to loss. For Butler, grief, and more specifically the collective act of mourning, creates a sense of political community. This collective act, and who is deemed worthy of receiving it, reveals our relational ties and their implications for our interdependency and the limitations of our ethical responsibility. Grief, Butler argues, can itself be made a resource for politics. We can ask who is mourned in public, in obituaries, in memorials, and reframe our political and moral imagination by expanding our vision for grievable bodies. We can learn what to grieve, and if our grief is poorly directed or dysfunctional, we can learn again what is worthy of sorrow and what is not. Now, the moral weight of our sorrow is not a new idea. It's essentially the argument put forward by St. Augustine in the 5th century as he sought to contradict the Stoic position that the truly wise would not experience sorrow. Instead, as Augustine put it in the City of God, Sorrow is an expression of love, and what matters is what we love. He writes, love then, yearning to have what is loved, is desire, and having and enjoying it is joy. Fleeing what is opposed to it is fear, and feeling what is opposed to it when it has befallen it, it is sadness. Now these motions are evil if the love is evil, good if the love is good. Sorrow or grief expressed over the loss of the good is a work of love we ought to pursue. The question before us, then, is how we learn the goods that are worthy of our grief. I am surrounded by lift the flat books, little wooden animals that march into a cheerfully apocalyptic arc, baby socks with dinosaurs and bears and daisies printed all over them, a giant stuffed lion and elephant that live under the coffee table. Tiny cars and trucks beep and zoom across the carpet. Plastic blocks build skyscrapers by the sofa. My 1-year-old is emerging into a world of words, the colours and shapes and textures that make up her play morphing into objects and creatures with names and identities. What names have we determined are worthy of her tiny attention? I look at her books, the first words that will shape her world, and they are full of farmed animals, sheep and cows and chickens and pigs, there for human consumption. Or there are animals from faraway places, crocodiles and octopuses and tigers and giraffes, to be admired in a zoo or on the television. There are precious few plants and almost nothing she might find in the local woods. She does not, it seems, need to know the word pigeon or crow or robin or blackbird or oak tree or dandelion or bluebell or hedgehog. What creatures are worthy of her attention? My daughter is growing up in the most nature-depleted country in Europe, and if her vocabulary ends up anything like her slightly older peers, it will also reflect that reality. A child cannot love a creature, cannot recognize it, cannot mourn its loss if she never even knows it exists. Who and what we grieve is directly related to who and what we notice and name. British nature writer Robert Macfarlane has paid particular attention to the political power of naming in shaping our relationship to other creatures. In Landmarks, he collates thousands of words describing the landscapes, nature, and weather of Britain and Ireland, alongside introducing writers who carefully describe and illuminate the land around them. Landmarks opens by attending to the wealth of deeply local knowledge contained in our language and its growing loss. He highlights this loss with reference to the Oxford Junior Dictionary's decision in 2007 to drop over 80 creature words from their new edition, including acorn, cowslip, heron, nectar, tulip, and wren. In response to a critical open letter by Macfarlane and other authors, Oxford University Press claimed that dictionaries are designed to reflect language as it is used. This defense reflects an ideology which treats speech as a neutral or organic reflection of existing attention, rather than a creative activity that makes attention itself. Learning names for things invites us to attend to them. As we revisit those names, commitment to this attention is strengthened. Macfarlane expresses this succinctly. We do not care for what we do not know, and on the whole, we do not know what we cannot name. The public debate with OUP inspired The Lost Words, a book by Macfarlane and visual artist Jackie Morris, which restores to children lost names for creatures so that restored relationship might follow. Shared names are cultural artifacts which invite other creatures into our world, and losing shared names is a symptom of and contribution to our alienation from other creatures. By contrast, passing on local creaturely names invites us to speak together about those places, to participate in storytelling, which tells us how we belong and who belongs. Macfarlane reminds us of the consequences of names being lost. Once the landscape goes undescribed and therefore unregarded, he writes, it becomes more vulnerable to unwise use or improper action. If naming other creatures can guide humans to responsibility, not naming them is not a neutral state, but a decisive exclusion from the kind of shelter humans can offer. As Macfarlane notes, language is fundamental to the possibility of re-wonderment. The language does not just register experience, it produces it. The contours and colours of words are inseparable from the feelings we create in relation to situations, to others, and to places. Language carries a formative as well as an informative impulse. To put it simply, what we name changes who we are. And as we enter a time of increasing ecological and climate instability, we not only lack names for the seasons and ecosystems we are losing, we lack names for the loss itself. Zadie Smith's essay, Elegy for a Country's Seasons, voices our lack of proficiency in naming loss. There is the scientific and ideological language for what is happening to the weather, but there are hardly any intimate words. If we can't talk about it, how can we possibly give it the attention it demands? Now, it's worth saying that the act of naming is as prone to sin as any other kind of speech. Naming is not inevitably offered out of love. It can express a desire to control or manage the other, and certainly interpretations of its religious significance have fallen prey to this temptation. The emerging field of taxonomy in the 17th century, for example, became closely tied to an emphasis on Adam's dominion over other creatures, the loss of this dominion at the fall, and a desire to redeem this managerial capacity through the sciences. Similarly, modern colonialism relies on suppressing local language, recognizing that the power to name the world in one's mother tongue is a power which creates community, identity, and strength. The impacts of this can be seen across the former British Empire and include the decline of Gaelic and Welsh in Britain and Ireland. The creative act of renaming, however, has a decolonizing power. Here is one example from my own context. In the book Thin Places, writer Kerry Doherty describes the trauma of growing up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland and maps her childhood in, departure from, and subsequent return to Ireland through her encounters with wild creatures. Though she is not a fluent Irish speaker, she carefully names each creature in Irish, a conscious reframing seeking to undermine their disenfranchisement from the ties of history, culture, and ecology. As a reflection of the political and ecological binding which creates belonging, she extends this renaming to herself. She also changes her name to its Irish spelling. Naming does not dissolve abuse, nor does it guarantee that flourishing will follow, but it remains a consistent desire in human encounters with other creatures. Human creatures are, for better or worse, name callers and christeners, as Macfarlane puts it. Our words are grained into our landscapes, and landscapes grained into our words. We are caught between the fraught claim of belonging or owning, particularly those of us belonging to nations with colonial identities, and the persistent desire to speak with affection and intimacy about the places we inhabit. Learning the names for the world around us also offers a starting point for quite literally finding common ground. We need a shared vocabulary so that we can talk about the world with others. In learning and passing on names of features or landmarks in the places we live, in collectively grieving the loss of creatures and places that we name and love, we perform a commitment to the place we find ourselves, however temporary or transient our lives might be. One cannot protest the actions of a landlord or factory or agribusiness if one does not know the names of the streets or fields they own, pollute, and destroy. One cannot mourn for ancient trees or nightingales or great crested newts if one does not know their names. In her memoir, Uprooting, Marshall Farrell describes this longing for common ground, for settled community. She begins with uneasy awareness of the colonial and migratory patterns of her family history in Trinidad and Tobago, bringing the reader with her as she struggles to root herself in an overwhelmingly white British village. Her sense of belonging emerges through her relationship with local flora, as she learns to name and understand native plants, which are often dismissed as weeds or common flowers. She finds that her sense of belonging begins to take root. Her account, however, is not naive to the human histories governing her commitment to local botany. As she tends her garden, she recognizes that the sense of familiar belonging she feels is due in significant part to the colonial presence of such plants in her grandmother's garden in the Caribbean. Farrell does not confuse the claim of belonging to place with denial of violent or uprooted history. Rather, she names the creatures found in her new home alongside rehearsing the names of her ancestors and their stories. This twin naming creates the possibility of putting down new and healthy roots, of meeting her neighbours on shared soil, of speaking truthfully about her past and present. So simply knowing the words for creatures does not equal intimate knowledge or attentiveness, but these words nevertheless remind us to look. They produce the possibility of honest attention. How we speak about the world shapes how we see the world, how we see losses in the world, how we understand our belonging or not to the creatures with whom we live. I turn now to the significance of this act of naming in the life of the church, the role naming plays in learning how to be a human creature in light of a creator God. Naming has obvious theological significance, going all the way back to the first pages of Scripture. In The Art of Speech, Catholic phenomenologist Jean-Louis Chrétien proposes that our speech is both a response to the world around us and also a transformative action. He begins with Genesis, interpreting Adam's creature naming as a gesture of hospitality to other creatures, not a one-off event, but a description of the human creature's relation with and responsibility towards the world. The first human speech in Genesis is naming. As each animal comes into the light of speech, he writes, they do not leave unchanged, but bearing a name that calls them. Humans, alongside all creatures, have already been spoken to by God and have obeyed. This act of naming is not dominance, but obedience to the kind of creature we are and the other kinds of creatures God has made. We are called to obey the very nature of things, he writes, gathering each creature under an arc of generous speech, which, I quote, shelters their being and their diversity. This description of naming as shelter is close to Macfarlane's warning about the consequences of names being lost. Once a landscape goes undescribed and therefore unregarded, Macfarlane writes, it becomes more vulnerable to unwise use or improper action. If naming other creatures can guide humans to responsibility, not naming is not a neutral state, but a decisive exclusion from the kind of shelter humans can offer. Naming is also an intrahuman gift. We do not simply name other creatures, we name each other, creating new possibilities for imagining how we belong to each other. I'm reminded of the link between love and naming made by the liberation theologian Father Gustavo Gutierrez. He writes, you say you care about the poor, then tell me, what are their names? Recognizing what we do and do not name helps us discern and describe truth about the world and our relations to each other, and our relations to each other as diverse creatures who are tasked with naming each other in order to know each other. As I have noted, naming is not inevitably hospitable, but hospitality for Jean-Louis Chrétien depends on this first welcome that we offer, this welcome of naming, and it is made hospitable when it is offered out of humility, the product of attention to the other, or as Chrétien describes it, listening. We welcome our fellow creatures in light of the speech of God and the world, to which humans always respond. Chrétien's interest in naming reflects his wider understanding of human experience, which interprets human relation to the world and God as response to a call. This call is necessarily mindful of the diverse and divergent voices which also speak. Those who speak to each other, Chrétien says, are never just two people. Even a face-to-face conversation is heavy with a distant rumor, and even intimacy has its own wide-open spaces. I think there's a chance or a risk that all this discussion of speech as a call on us can make the act of naming seem quite abstract and detached from the world as it really is. We might ask ourselves, what right do we have to decide the names of different creatures? How do we know that the names we use are offered out of genuine attention rather than a desire for control? Chrétien directly addresses that concern, the concern that naming can function as violent imposition in the Arc of Speech. He points to a tendency amongst some modern philosophers of language to describe Adam's name giving in Genesis as negation or even murder, rather than welcome. In doing so, they assume that speech and our sensory encounters with the world are separate from each other. But Chrétien claims that our whole bodies participate in both receiving the speech of the world and in offering speech back to the world and to God. He writes, "The speech we utter about the world does not come from beyond the world. It is no more a stranger to the world than we are. And what this speech sets out to do is not to impose on it from the outside through our own initiative and arbitrary meaning. Instead, as he proposes in another book, The Call and the Response, our senses act as a unity. The act of naming should emerge from our literally being in touch with the world around us." So when Chrétien insists that truly seeing the suffering and beauty of those visible creatures around us is to be dedicated to providing them forever with the asylum of our own voice, and that's a quote from his book, he does not simply have in mind that we abstractly speak about the world as though our speech can be detached from the responses of our other senses, as though they make no demand on us. Rather, the voice of the world speaks an appeal for compassion, he writes. It's therefore a bodily demand. We are one body receiving signs from another. If that's the case, then the act of naming ought not to be an abstract exercise or a detached articulation of power, but a loving response. We might compare, for example, the cultural sticking power of a local name for an animal or plant when it's given to voice a lived experience of that animal or plant, as opposed to its Latin name given to systemize its existence. The former local name makes a demand on our attention in a way that the latter does not. For example, it's much easier to remember local names than Latin names. When we try to attend to the speech of the world around us, when we listen to it with our bodies, we are forced to admit that we often fail to listen or to speak truthfully or adequately. But it is only in the attempt to listen that we can receive the world we are offered. To give a simple example of what this sensitive sensory naming means in our everyday experience, my 1-year-old daughter is currently fascinated by hedges, and when we go on walks, she wants to touch each hedge. It is not experientially sufficient for her to touch just one kind of hedge, because as her senses tell her, the plants that make up hedges are not just generic hedge, they each feel different. They are different kinds of creatures. This one is privet, this one is laurel, this one is yew, and so on. And as she learns these names, this naming will reflect her sensory experience. We name to differentiate one creature from another. But our naming also reinforces and shores up this differentiation, such that we can continue to see and pass on this attentiveness to others. If, by contrast, each laurel, yew, and privet bush simply becomes hedge in her mind, her attentiveness to their difference will diminish over time. There are, of course, more things in the world than we can ever touch, learn, or attend to. If all our speech is a response to these diverse calls on us, we have to ask ourselves what kind of speech we will respond to and to whose speech we will listen. I think that one of our greatest challenges to overcome in responding well to overwhelming loss is that this careful, focused listening is very difficult. We are pulled in many different directions, and usually in the direction of the most powerful voices. So in practicing this selective attention, we need to have in mind the call on us to participate in God's redemptive work in the world. When we name our surroundings, we are not simply learning to report our environment as it is for the sake of greater accuracy in speech. We are speaking redemptively, conforming our attention to the compassion demonstrated in Christ. It is this Christ who saw the trouble which burdened his disciples and directed their attention to the birds of the air and the lilies of the field as signs of the kingdom. It is the same Christ who knew the sorrow of the oppressed and reinstated an outcast woman by naming her daughter before her community. When, likewise, we bear witness to the shared names of creatures or communities which have previously gone unnoticed, dismissed, or misnamed, we are remade in the image of the Christ who saw unnoticed signs of glory and called forth those whose voices had gone unheard. The task of naming our sorrow requires that we see this loss through the eyes of Christ and act in line with this new seeing, these new signs to which we attend. If we do so, our expression of sorrow will bear the moral authority of the one we claim to follow. Christians are not alone in this remaking work. We communicate with others who seek to receive signs in renewed ways. But our naming must come from the conviction that the priorities of God have already been announced. I now want to focus further on how the act of naming intervenes in conflicting narratives of who is worthy of attention and how we participate in this as a church. To do so, I turn, as Chrétien does, to prayer. Like all speech, prayer teaches the one who prays. But Chrétien does not simply treat prayer as speech with God in mind. Prayerful speech for Chrétien is both the fulfillment of our humanity and an offering which creates coherence and communion amongst creatures which had previously appeared disparate. The theological anthropology underlying Chrétien's study of prayer speaks directly to the place and related role of humans in relation to other creatures. In the Ark of Speech, Chrétien employs the tradition of humans as priests of creation. Our prayer supplements and offers up the song of creation. Our humanity is completed in communion with the world. Our speech turns the world from a, quote, scattered vocabulary into a poem. The call to which prayer responds comes from both God and the world. Belonging to the world offers the attention required to know what to pray, and prayer in turn teaches a new kind of worldliness, making our attention new. But this is not a personal offering. Chrétien describes prayer as a choral act, both because the non-human voices of the world are a polyphony, and because if we wish to offer words of peace, they must be offered in communion as a unity. This does not mean that the individual voice is silenced. On the contrary, we cannot realize or exercise our individual voice or story without participating in the choir, where we both give and receive, hear the hymns of others and ourselves heard. So what happens when we speak the names of creatures in gathered prayer? The names of creatures offered in public praise and petition is, I believe, one key way in which the Church creates and curates sorrow over anthropogenic loss. Firstly, petition. The Church's practice of intercessory prayer is responsive to contextual changes and able to redirect attention to local narratives which might otherwise go unheard or dismissed. We name the vulnerable, marginal, grieving, downhearted, and lonely. And in this act of naming, we speak desires about the place we live and trust that our actions will be more aligned with these desires. But desires can be divergent, so public prayer often includes specifically local names, creating collective attention by saying those names out loud. These names' needs may not reflect the dominant narratives of a place, given their reliance on the admission of vulnerability. But, for example, in reciting the names of the sick and the dying, the community creates signs which direct attention to needs or desires that may have otherwise remained unrecognized. This motivates seeing a place as it really is. By contrast, public prayer, which avoids specificity, refuses to name requests, or focuses only on the inner life of the church, has the inverse effect. The worshipping community becomes further alienated from its placed reality. Secondly, praise. Here again, we find that speech offered as prayer has a distinctively transformative quality. Chrétien insists that this resistance is made possible when our attentive desire to belong is prompted by thanksgiving rather than ownership. He writes, "Nothing before God belongs to us as our own, if not our ability to say thank you. The praise that responds to the divine giving is the essence of human speech. The speech most proper to man is thus the speech which is turned to the other, given to the other, a speech of transmigration that crosses boundaries, a speech that is eccentric. This speech has the strength of its weakness, for the voice that praises always has something tremulous about it, knowing at one and the same time that it cannot be enough, and yet that nothing other than it can be enough. Thanksgiving holds within it both an outward gaze and knowledge of limitation, which ensures room is made for the other. If our attention is plastic enough that it can be remade by redirected speech, naming those things for which we are thankful might create a receptivity whereby we are both committed to the gift received and know that our belonging must necessarily be shared. And Chrétien goes still further. Thankful speech is the only kind that can approximate truthful speech. If we want to tell the truth about our loved and fragile world, we must begin by offering these names in grateful praise. So I have proposed two stages to the role of naming in learning and expressing grief. Firstly, we, all humans, can learn and perpetuate names which create and strengthen our love for the world. We can learn the names of creatures, landscape features, people, and places, and we can pass those names on in our speech. This helps us to attend to our environment in a way that deepens our sense of belonging to it. Secondly, the kinds of names we emphasize are governed by the stories we tell about ourselves. And so the church's offering a public speech must propose a compelling narrative which encourages a particular kind of belonging, which redirects the community's attention. There may be creatures whose names are at risk of being lost forever, colonized landmarks to be renamed, humans who cannot currently participate in this naming or who have lost the ability. Giving prayerful thanks for those human and non-human creatures who are unnoticed or even directly persecuted is transformative. In rehearsing their names, they become grievable. They are sheltered by the arc of our speech. This second stage is not straightforward, not least because it is impossible for us to ever learn the names of all those in need of this protective and welcoming voice. But there is humble joy in acknowledging the complexity and diversity of creatures to which we must attend. In this act of praying aloud together, we perform a particular vision for the world, which serves as an invitation to others. All of us everywhere are watching the disintegration of the places that anchor us to the world. These losses are not new. They are driven by a centuries-old practice of stripping away the goodness of naming and knowing place from other people. Colonial land grabs, slavery, forced migration, and internments have fueled the markets which now destroy all of us. What is new, however, is the universal experience of this destruction. No longer disguised by mysterious chains of supply and demand, the collapse has reached even my door here at the heart of the former British Empire. If we are to live and grieve honestly, we must learn how to name the world out of love, to be creatures who christen place, to speak the names of the dying such that their stories can shape our future. It is not that names might cure our chronic displacement on their own, nor that our words are necessary for goodness to endure. But our speech together is nevertheless essential to our placemaking. The world really does become a world when it comes into the light of speech. The names we offer to or withhold from other creatures not only reflects the kind of world that we desire, but it also transforms it. Thank you for listening.